In today's video, I'm going to explain all of the print settings for your SLA printer. Stick around. What is up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to go through all of the print settings for your SLA printer one by one, and we'll start from the top and we'll go through about 6 of those settings. Those are the main settings that you need to know just to hit the ground running. So you've just got your printer and you don't have time to go through the manual, but you go to the forums and everybody keeps talking about exposure times and layers and bottom layers and everything else, and you really want to find out what does that mean. So in this video, I'm going to go through the main settings that you need to know to get a print going on your printer. So printing on an SLA printer is very different from printing on an FDM printer. You got to remember that with an FDM printer, you print from the bottom up, and with an SLA printer, you print from the top down. So that's the very first concept you need to wrap your head around. A very easy way to think about SLA printing is to split your model conceptually into 2 parts, the bottom part and the top part. The bottom part usually consists of a few layers, and the top part consists of the rest of the print. So in your slicer, you are going to see this separated into 2 sections, the bottom part and the top part. The bottom part has a few parameters that apply to the bottom few layers only, and the rest of the settings apply to the rest of the print. So we are going to go through these settings one by one, and we are going to start with the bottom part of your print. So the first thing you're going to see is the bottom layer count. Now if you think about your print as a number of stacked layers, the number of layers that are closest to the build plate is the bottom layer count, and you could set how many layers you want to be the bottom section of your print. Most of the time, people will set that to be anywhere between 6 and 10 layers in some instances where the bottom settings apply. And why do we separate the print into a bottom and a top section? Is because the bottom part of your print, usually you want to apply different settings that will allow your print to adhere very well to your build plate. So the very first parameter we just spoke about is the number of bottom layers. And in this case, the number of bottom layers are the layers that are closest to your build plate. The next setting is the bottom exposure time. So these layers that are very close to the build plate, as they are being built up from the build plate to the top, you are going to expose the bottom layers differently from the rest of your print. So the bottom exposure time is the time that you want to expose those bottom layers that you just set, and usually that's different from the rest of the layers in your print. So you would see in some instances those bottom layers are usually set anywhere between 45 seconds, and the reason you want such a high exposure level at those lower layers is to ensure that your print adheres to the build plate. So those are the 2 parameters we have spoken about so far: the number of layers close to the build plate, or bottom layers as it's called, and the exposure time for those bottom layers. The bottom light off delay is the amount of time you want the light to remain off before it starts to cure the next layer. So if for instance, you just cured one layer and your build plate moves away from the vat, when it gets back into the vat, the bottom light off delay is the amount of seconds you set before the UV light comes on to cure the next layer. The next parameter we're going to be looking at is the bottom lift distance. So when you're curing the bottom layers, the build plate moves away from the vat every time one layer is cured, and the bottom lift distance is how far from the vat you would like the build plate to lift before it returns to cure the next layer. The next parameter we're going to talk about is the bottom lift speed. So when the build plate is moving away from the vat, the speed at which it moves away from the vat is called the bottom lift speed. And one thing you would have noticed is all of these settings that I just mentioned, they all apply to the bottom part of your print, as I had mentioned earlier. So you set a certain number of layers that all of these bottom settings apply to, and once the bottom layers are cured, then you move to the rest of your print, and all of the other parameters apply to the rest of your print. So the other parameter is the layer thickness. This really sets how thick the layers are and how many layers your print is going to be split into. So generally, the default is 0.05 millimeters for most slicers. You could take this down to probably about 0.02 millimeters depending on the slicer to give you that fine detail that you're looking for. The next parameter is the exposure time, and this applies to how many seconds you would like the layers to be exposed for. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, these apply to the rest of your print and not the bottom section. The next parameter is the light off delay. Very similar to the first parameter called bottom light off delay. The light off delay is the amount of time you would like the UV LED to remain off before it starts to cure the next layer. And usually this helps if you have a very viscous resin and you would like that build plate to settle properly before you start exposing the next layer. The next parameter is the lift distance, and this is the distance the build plate lifts from the vat before returning to the vat to cure the next layer. The next parameter is the lift speed, and the lift speed is how fast the build plate lifts out of the vat before returning to the vat to cure the next layer. The speed at which the build plate returns to the vat is called the retraction speed. That is the last parameter in the print settings that you need to know about before setting up your print. So just to recap, the main settings are the bottom layer count, the bottom exposure time, the bottom light off delay, and the bottom lift distance. This applies to the bottom layers of your print. The next set of parameters apply to the rest of the print. So the first parameter is your layer height, which sets the quality essentially for your print. The exposure time, the amount of time each layer is going to be exposed with the UV light to cure. The light off delay, which is the amount of time you set for the UV LED to be off before starting to cure the next layer. The lift distance, the distance the build plate lifts from the vat before returning to the vat to cure the next layer. The lifting speed, which is the speed at which the build plate lifts from the vat, and the retraction speed, which is the speed at which the build plate returns to the vat. So those are the 11 main print parameters that you usually set in your slicer before you start printing. One thing to note, generally if you're on a forum or you're asking questions about print settings, people usually post these in the form of 3 numbers. The first number is the exposure time for the bottom layers. The second number is the number of bottom layers. And the third number is your normal exposure time for the rest of layers in your print. Now these are the main settings for an SLA print. And believe me, this is nothing compared to the list that you would see for an FDM print. So as you continue changing resins, you would notice that you will need to change some of these parameters to ensure that the print is successful. One of the main ones that you change is the bottom exposure time and the normal exposure time for the rest of the layers. Once you tweak these exposure times, this gives your print enough time to cure on the build plate and you have a successful print. If your exposure time is too little, you find that the layers don't cure properly and it tends to be a little bit mushy. And if you set your exposure time too high, you find that you have over curing, and in some instances you may find that the tolerances on your part tend to be a little bit off. So you end up with an elephant foot very close to your build plate, and as your print grows, the size of the print tends to be a little bit larger if you overexpose the layers. The resin that I usually use for my prints is the Elegoo gray resin, and if you check here, you would find my settings for the rook profile, which I have found to work perfectly with the gray resin to give you very beautiful prints. So feel free to check that out, and also feel free to check my video on how to apply supports. So there you have it guys, my explanation of the print settings in your slicer for your SLA printer. If you have any comments, please leave them below. If you like this video, please hit like and don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell right there so that you'll be notified when I have another video coming. Have a good one and happy printing.